I sent $3,100 every month for 2 years, quietly. No announcement. When I mentioned it once at dinner, my dad said, "What money? You've never done anything for this family." I didn't correct him in front of everyone. I just opened my banking app, turned the screen toward my uncle, and pressed Show History. The table went completely silent. My dad said, that can't be right." I said, "It's right. My name is Caleb. I'm 31 years old. I'm a back-end software developer at a mid-sized logistics company. And I need to tell you about the dinner that ended a version of myself I'd been performing for most of my adult life. The version that quietly handled things. The version that never made it weird. The version that would have smiled and changed the subject instead of turning a phone screen toward his uncle and letting 24 months of wire transfers do the talking. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I grew up in Harwick, Ohio. Not a city, not quite a town. One of those places that exists in the middle distance between somewhere and nowhere. The kind of place where everybody knows your dad's truck, but not necessarily your name. We lived in a split-level house on Krenner Road with a concrete driveway that always needed resealing and a backyard that was mostly crabgrass and my dad's ambitions for a garden he never actually planted. My parents, Frank and Lorraine. Frank worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant for 30 years, which sounds more stable than it was. He communicated primarily through grunts, football commentary, and the occasional declaration of what something cost. Lorraine worked checkout at a grocery store until her knees gave out. Then, she managed the household with a combination of genuine warmth and complete strategic blindness about anything she didn't want to see. She loved all three of her kids. She just loved them differently. My siblings, Bowen and Paige. Bowen is 2 years older than me. Bowen is the kind of guy who walks into a room and the room reorganizes itself around him. Tall, easy laugh, the ability to tell a story about going to the gas station that somehow ends with everyone crying from laughing. He dropped out of 2 colleges, got fired from 4 jobs that I know of, borrowed money from basically everyone in the family at one point or another, and was still the person my dad called first about anything important. When Bowen turned 25, my parents threw him a party with a cake that had his face on it, not a photo on frosting. His actual face rendered in fondant. I'm not exaggerating. I have photos. Paige is 2 years younger than me. Paige is the serious one, the good one, the one who got good grades and gave a speech at her high school graduation and got a scholarship to a state university. My parents drove 6 hours to watch her graduate. They put the framed diploma in the living room. These are not complaints. Paige earned all of that. Paige is genuinely the best of us. I just note the math. When I graduated from the same university, 2 years later, there was a card in the mail and a 30-minute phone call my dad spent mostly asking if I could look at their router when I was home next. "That's great, bud," he said. About the degree. Like, I'd want a gift card. Here are some other things I want to name, because alone they sound petty, and together they start to form a shape. Bowen's 16th birthday, a used car, blue, with a bow on it. Mine, a card with $40 and a note that said gas money. Paige, also a car. So this wasn't about money being tight. This was about who the money followed. When I got my first real job offer after graduation, a developer role at a startup, good salary, actual health insurance, I called home. My mom said she was proud. My dad said, "Does it have a pension?" And then told me that Bowen had just gotten a new job at a sporting goods store and was really turning a corner. When I moved into my first apartment, no one helped me move. Not because they were busy. Bowen had been planning a camping trip that weekend for 2 months, and my dad didn't want to miss the send-off. I rented a van, moved 63 boxes by myself, and ordered a pizza I ate on the floor because I didn't have a table yet. The table I eventually bought is very nice. I want you to know that. By the time I was 27, I'd settled into something that actually looked like a life. The job had grown. I'd moved on from the startup to the logistics company, where I was a back-end developer, working on the infrastructure that kept shipment tracking systems running, which sounds boring to describe and is occasionally genuinely boring to do, but pays well and gives me problems to solve. And I have always liked solving problems more than I've liked talking about my feelings. So it worked out. My apartment was a 1-bedroom in a building with good light and bad parking. I had a bookshelf that covered an entire wall, and a cat named Colonel who regarded me with the specific contempt that only rescue cats who've been through something can sustain. He had one ear. He'd been found in a parking garage. We understood each other. My best friend was a guy named Declan, who I'd met at a hackathon in my second year of working, and who had the singular personality trait of being incapable of giving a vague answer to any question. You ask Declan what he wants for dinner, and he will tell you exactly which restaurant, which dish, which table he prefers, and why. This is somehow not annoying when Declan does it. It is, in fact, profoundly restful. There are no games with Declan. Everything is on the surface. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I had it. My boss was a woman named Sloane, early 50s, kept a small cactus collection on her windowsill, had a habit of leaving single-sentence notes in Slack that somehow conveyed everything. She noticed things. When she liked your work, she said so specifically, "The solution you built for the routing logic last Tuesday is why we didn't have an outage this week." Not, "Great job." The actual thing. I had not previously understood that this was a thing a person could do for another person. And then there was my family, which I still drove 3 hours to see on holidays, still called on birthdays, still quietly supplemented financially, which brings us to the part I need to tell you about. It started the way a lot of things in my family started. Someone needed something, and they asked the person who wouldn't make it weird to provide it. The ask came from my mom, in a phone call on a Tuesday, which should have been my first sign. Lorraine only called on Tuesdays when she needed to talk before she talked herself out of it. The mortgage payment was behind. Frank's hours had been cut. Could I help, just for a month or two? I said yes. Of course I said yes. She was my mother, and she sounded genuinely scared, and I had the money. The first transfer was $3,100. I remember picking that number because it was exactly what I calculated they needed to cover the mortgage and their utilities and leave a little buffer. I set up a recurring transfer. I told myself it was temporary. You already know how temporary it was. For 24 months, 24, I sent that transfer on the first of every month without saying anything about it, without flagging it at dinners, without mentioning it to Bowen or Paige, without putting it in a card or making a moment out of it. I didn't want a moment. I wanted the problem solved. This was, I would later understand, in a therapy office with a very good therapist, perhaps not the healthiest reason to give someone $74,400. But it was my reason. The clearest version of the pattern crystallizing, not the final break, just the moment I saw the shape of it, came at Thanksgiving of the first year. I had driven 3 hours. I had brought a pie and a bottle of wine and fixed the loose socket cover in the upstairs bathroom that my dad had been complaining about since August. We sat down to dinner, and my dad gave a toast, which he almost never did. He talked about Bowen's new job at a distribution center. He talked about Paige's promotion. And then he said, "And everybody else is just doing their thing." And I almost laughed. I almost actually laughed. The man whose mortgage I was paying had just categorized me as everybody else. I told myself it was fine. I was wrong. The dinner that broke everything open was in March, 14 months into the transfers. It was Bowen's birthday dinner. The family drove to a steakhouse 40 minutes from the house, which I also drove 3 hours to attend, because that is the kind of thing I did. Round table, 6 people. Frank, Lorraine, Bowen with his girlfriend Darla, Paige and my Uncle Gerald, Frank's younger brother, who comes to most family things and who I have always liked because he has the rare quality of actually listening when you speak. It was going fine. The bread was good. The steaks were ordered. Bowen was being Bowen. Generous with his stories, easy to be around. Nobody's enemy. And then there was a lull in conversation, the kind that happens when everyone is buttering bread at the same time. And I made a mistake. Not a big one. Not an accusation. I mentioned offhandedly that I'd noticed the most recent transfer had a small routing issue, and I'd had to resend it. I was, genuinely, just making small talk. It was something I thought everyone at the table already knew, at minimum, my dad and my mom. It was a conversational thread I assumed existed. My dad put down his fork. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as offended confusion. The face of someone who has been told the building they're sitting in doesn't technically exist. What money? He said. There was a beat. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. You've never done anything for this family. The table didn't go silent immediately. There was a half second of continued ambient noise. Darla's fork hitting her plate, someone's water glass going down. And then it did. It went completely, specifically, attentively silent. I want to tell you I felt a wave of something. Grief, rage, the specific exhaustion of someone who's been carrying something heavy for a long time. But mostly what I felt was a kind of flatness, a click, like a door with a faulty latch finally closing all the way. I looked at my dad, I looked at my uncle. Gerald was watching me with the particular stillness of someone who has understood that something significant is about to happen. I reached into my jacket, took out my phone, opened my banking app, the one I use for transfers, the one with the transaction history going back 4 years. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a speech. I turned the screen toward my uncle, who was sitting next to me, and I pressed show history and I set the phone on the table between us where anyone could see it. The silence changed texture. 24 entries. First of, every month, $3,100 each. The most recent one flagged with the routing note I just mentioned. I hadn't annotated them or added notes. They were labeled, in the bank's default format, transfer to Lorraine Whitmore, my mother's name, her checking account, which is where I had assumed both of them saw the money arrive. My uncle looked at the screen. He didn't say anything. He picked up the phone slowly and looked more carefully at the column of dates, the column of amounts. He set it back down. My dad said, that can't be right. I said, it's right. My mother had started crying quietly, which I found out later was because she had told my dad about the transfers in month 1, and he had somehow, genuinely, with what I believe was sincere self-protective amnesia, restructured his memory of events to not include that information. Bowen said, Caleb, I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. And I meant it. Bowen's problem has never been malice. It's that his world is exactly the size of what he can see from where he's standing. Paige was looking at the tablecloth. My dad said, I just meant I picked up my phone. I put it back in my jacket. I said, the steak's getting cold. And that was that. That was it. That was all of it. I drove home that night instead of staying. 3 hours alone in my car is a lot of time to be alone with yourself. And I spent most of it not crying, which felt important, and some of it listening to a podcast about medieval architecture that I remember nothing about, which also felt necessary. When I got home, Colonel was on the couch, and he looked at me with his one ear and his contempt, and I sat down next to him, and he tolerated my hand on his back for approximately 45 seconds before moving to the armchair, which is more warmth than he usually extends. I didn't call the next day, or the day after. I ran a kind of experiment. I stopped initiating, stopped calling first, stopped texting good morning, or happy Monday, or a link to something I thought my mom would find interesting. I waited. I wanted to see what the absence felt like on the other end, or if it registered at all. It took 19 days before anyone reached out, and it was a text from my mom that said, haven't heard from you, hope everything's okay, which was warm and true and completely devoid of any reference to the dinner or the phone screen or the 2 years of transfers. Just, hope everything's okay. I replied, all good. Busy. Bowen texted 4 days later to ask if I knew a good deal on a new laptop because he was buying one for a course he was taking. That was his reach. A laptop recommendation. I sent him a link and nothing else. He said legend, and I didn't respond to that. My dad did not contact me. The weeks were, surprisingly, fine. More than fine. There was something unfamiliar in the space that had previously been occupied by waiting to be acknowledged. I used it to work, mostly. I had a project, a rebuild of our data pipeline infrastructure that needed my full attention. And I gave it that attention, and something happened that I can only describe as my brain finding out what it's like to run without background noise. My boss Sloan noticed before I did. She stopped by my desk one afternoon. She never stops by desks. She's a Slack person. And said, you seem different. Whatever you're doing, Keep doing it." Then she went back to her office and her cactus collection and said nothing more about it. This is how Sloane compliments. Small, precise, and never followed up on. I found myself sitting with those 11 words for the rest of the day. Around this time, I'd been seeing a therapist, Dr. Ashby, who had an office in a building that smelled like old carpet and had a small digital clock on the bookshelf that I looked at too often. Dr. Ashby wore the same kind of reading glasses every session and had the habit of waiting about 4 beats longer than comfortable before responding to anything. The first time she did it, I almost filled the silence with more words. After a few sessions, I understood that the silence was the point. I told her about the dinner, the full version, the transfers, my dad's face, the phone screen, the drive home. She listened without interrupting, which she was very good at. When I finished, she said, "You weren't sending them money to help them. You were sending them money to prove you were worth keeping." I sat with that for a long time. "That's not a criticism," she added. "That's grief. You were paying for something that should have been free." Here's what I want to say about that moment. I didn't cry. I've been through enough therapy to know that the breakthrough moments don't always look like what you expect. Sometimes they just feel like something going still, like a wheel that has been spinning finding a flat surface. I drove home and fed Colonel and made dinner and went to bed. And somewhere between falling asleep and waking up, I understood that the whole project of my financial generosity had been, in some deep and quiet way, an attempt to buy unconditional love with extremely conditional transfers, and that this was a transaction that was never going to balance. Declan came over that Saturday with beer and a board game he'd been insisting I try for months. And we sat on my floor and played it, and he beat me thoroughly and said, "You'll get it eventually," in a tone of complete insincerity. And I felt, for the first time in a long while, something in the vicinity of light. The call from my dad came on a Wednesday, 11 weeks after the dinner. Not about the dinner, not an apology. He needed me to look into refinancing options for the house. The interest rate situation? He'd read something online. He thought maybe there was something to do about it, and I would know. His voice had the particular cadence it always had when he needed something. A little warmer, a little more available, asking questions about how I was doing before getting to the actual point. I had heard this voice my entire life. I had spent my entire life not naming what it was. "Dad," I said. "Yeah, I'm not going to help with the refinancing right now." A pause. "Okay, I just thought, since you know about this stuff, I know I'm going to need some time before I'm back to being the person you call for this kind of thing." Another pause. Longer. "Is this about the dinner?" It's about a lot of things that the dinner made clear. I could hear him adjusting in whatever chair he was sitting in. The creak of it. I didn't mean what I said. I was embarrassed. "I know that," I said. And I did. I genuinely did. But I've been taking care of things for a long time without anyone knowing. And when I mentioned it once, the response was that I'd never done anything for this family. So I need some time. He said, "Okay." Not "I'm sorry." Not "you're right." Just "okay." Which, from my father, I recognized as the first honest syllable he'd offered me in years. I'll take it. The confrontation, the real one, happened 6 weeks after that call, at my parents' kitchen table. Not a restaurant. The kitchen. My mother's kitchen, with the yellow curtains and the coffee maker that has made the same sputtering noise since 2009. I drove down on a Saturday. Just me. I had, in the weeks before, put together a document. Not a spreadsheet, a simple list. Dates, amounts, events. The camping trip the weekend I moved. The graduation phone call. Bowen's car, my card with $40. The Thanksgiving toast that categorized me as everybody else. 24 months of wire transfers totaling $74,400. Now confirmed to have been known by my mother and not communicated to my father. Which was its own thing I chose not to relitigate, because Lorraine had called me twice since the dinner, and cried both times, and I understood that she had been caught in the middle of something she hadn't known how to name. My dad was at the table already. My mom made coffee. I didn't have notes in front of me. I knew the document by heart. I said, "I don't need you to apologize. I need you to understand what actually happened, so that I can decide what I want this relationship to look like going forward. My dad said, "All right." And I went through it. Specifically, calmly, not as an accusation, but as a record. In April of 2021, I sent the first transfer. Here's the bank reference number if you need it. In November of 2022, I drove 3 hours to Thanksgiving, fixed the socket cover in the upstairs bathroom, brought a pie and a bottle of wine, and was included in your toast as everybody else. I have receipts for the pie and the wine. I'm not showing you the receipts. I'm just telling you what I have. My dad said nothing through most of this. He looked at the table. His hands were around his coffee mug. He's a big man, my dad, and he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. When I got to the dinner, the steakhouse, the quote, the phone screen, he said, I was embarrassed. I said the wrong thing. You said I'd never done anything for this family. I know I did. You said it in front of Gerald and Darla and Paige. I know. And I want you to know that I'm not here because I want to punish you for it. I'm here because I want you to understand the actual shape of what's been happening, so that if I choose to be close to you going forward, we're both starting from the same understanding of what's true. He looked up, and here is the moment of genuine humanity I want to give him. Because I told you, these aren't villains. His eyes were wet. Frank Whitmore, who has communicated primarily through grunts and football scores for 30 years, had wet eyes. He said, I didn't see you. I don't know why. I know that's not. I don't know why. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't enough, but it was real, and I recognized it as real, and that mattered. Not to fix anything, just to be true. My mother was crying properly by that point, and she reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, You are the best thing we made, Caleb. I need you to know that, which is the kind of sentence that would be very moving if she had ever said it before. But it was the first time. So it was moving and devastating, and 31 years late, and still, somehow, something. Paige, who had driven down separately and come in during the middle of it, sat quietly through most of it, and then said, when there was a pause, I knew you were sending money. Mom told me in month 2. I should have said something to you. I'm sorry. That one actually got me. Because Paige is the one who sees everything. And she had seen this and stayed quiet, which is its own choice. But she said sorry, and she meant it. And she looked at me directly when she said it. And I love my sister, so I put it in the category of things that are being repaired. Bowen texted me that afternoon. He hadn't come, which I had expected. He said, I heard what happened. I'm a selfish idiot. That's not an excuse, but it's true. You're a better person than me. I love you, which is the most self-aware thing Bowen has ever said in writing, and I screenshotted it. Not to use against him, but because I suspect I'll want proof someday that he said it. My dad didn't apologize outright. He said, I didn't see you, and he meant it. And he didn't repeat the original lie, and he refilled my coffee without being asked, which from Frank Whitmore is the gesture equivalent of a written apology and a fruit basket. That was 4 months ago. Here's what has changed. My mother calls on Tuesdays still, but now she actually says what she called to say from the beginning. My dad sent me a text last month about a news story he thought I'd find interesting. A news story. Unprompted. I showed it to Declan, and he said, hold on. Is that growth? With the same tone he uses to identify bird species, which is to say, total sincerity disguised as dryness. And I said, I think it might be. Paige and I have a standing Saturday call now. 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. We talk about our actual lives. This is new. This is good. Bowen is still Bowen. But he bought me a very nice bottle of whiskey for my birthday, with a card that was not purchased in a gas station, and showed up at my apartment to hand it to me himself, which required a 4-hour drive. I won't overstate it. I will note it. The transfer stopped. My dad got his hours back in January. If they need something, I'll evaluate it when it comes. But I won't do it invisibly. That part is over. A few weeks ago, Declan and I drove out to a state park on a Sunday and spent about 4 hours walking and talking about nothing consequential. On the drive back, he said, You seem like you've put something down. I thought about that for a second and said, yeah. He nodded and put on a playlist he'd made called Sunday Evening Bittersweet, which was a playlist he had clearly thought about. And I looked out the window at the flat Ohio landscape going by and felt something I'm going to call peace. even though that word is embarrassing to use out loud. And Sloan last week pulled me into a one-on-one and told me the data pipeline rebuild is going to be featured in a company-wide presentation, and she wanted me to present it myself. You built it, she said. You should be the one to talk about it. I have been waiting 31 years for someone to say a sentence that simple. It turns out you built it. You should be the one to talk about it. Is the kind of sentence that makes you have to take a long, slow breath before responding. Colonel, for his part, has started sleeping at the foot of my bed. Still contemptuous. Still damaged in ways that will probably never fully resolve. Still here. My name is Caleb. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a software developer who has recently learned that visibility is not something you earn by making yourself useful enough. You don't buy it, and you don't engineer it. You create the conditions for it by choosing where to put yourself and what you're willing to carry. The money was never the point. The point was always that I needed someone to see me without the money first. A few months ago, I turned a phone screen toward my uncle and let 24 months of silence speak for itself. I'm still deciding what I want my life with my family to look like. But I am, for the first time in a long time, the one doing the deciding. That's the difference. That's the whole thing.